Good evening. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the Fall 2019 Beimfohr-Neuss Lecture. My name is Ryan O'Dowd and I serve as Senior Fellow at Chesterton House and as the pastor at Bread of Life Anglican Church here in Ithaca. Our lecture is made possible by Linda Beimfohr and Carl and Elaine Neuss. The late Al Beimfohr was a member of the Cornell class of 1966. And we are pleased to welcome Carl Neuss, class of 1976, and his wife Elaine, who are with us this evening. Tonight, as many of you know, is the inaugural event of our long-anticipated dedication of our women's residence and the 20th anniversary of Chesterton House. Following the lecture tonight, we'll provide information about the numerous events taking place tomorrow and over the weekend. We welcome those who are joining us by live stream, and I ask those of you who are with us tonight to please silence your phones. Our speaker tonight is an accomplished musician and a distinguished theologian. He specializes in the theology of imagination, beauty, and wonder. Easily overlooked, these are all cherished biblical virtues. Listen as the psalmist declares, "How wonderful are your works, O Lord! In wisdom you have made them all." And then Paul, at his peak in Romans, "Oh, the depths of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, how unfathomable his ways." No biblical writer rivals the awe-inspired proverbialist, known only to us as Augur, the son of Yaka. "Three things are too wonderful for me, for I do not understand. The way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a snake on the rock, the way of a ship in the midst of the sea, and the way of a man with a woman." Augur is hypnotized by life's mysteries, whether beautiful or ghastly. From the eye that mocks the father and scorns a mother, and a people whose teeth are swords, to lizards you can hold in your hand, yet run freely in a king's palace. Our namesake, G.K. Chesterton, would have been in good company among these biblical lyricists. He championed the God of the poets over the gods of the philosophers. He exhorted us to embrace the strange and secure, both wonder and welcome. To be happy in this wonderland, he wrote, without once being merely comfortable. Dr. Junius Johnson is a natural addition to this merry band. Assistant professor of historical theology at Baylor University, Dr. Johnson holds a PhD in theology from Yale University with an expertise in Trinitarian theology, Christology, metaphysics, and the Eucharist. He's an adjunct research fellow at the Rivendell Institute at Yale, Christian Studies Center, like Chesterton House, and he is a board member of the Consortium of Christian Study Centers, an organization of which Chesterton House is a founding member. He is the author of 3 books. His fourth, The Father of Lights, A Theology of Beauty, Theology for the Life of the World, is scheduled for publication by Brazos Press next year. He has also collaborated in numerous musical recordings as a writer and a producer. In his forthcoming book on a theology of beauty, Dr. Johnson reminds us immediately of Augur and of Chesterton. Quote, "We are driven by what already lies within our hearts, to seek what we would not seek if we were not already in possession of it. But it is bigger than we are, and bigger than we could ever be. It is very eternity. It is a semper maius, always more, that haunts and drives our being." G.K. Chesterton once wrote, "We might almost say that the whole advantage of having the kingdom within is that we look for it somewhere else." As if in conversation, Dr. Johnson replies, "To have eternity in our hearts is to possess the whole as whole, but in a partial way. We see that there is more to see. And so in this seeing, we become aware that we cannot see all the way to beginning or end. In my early years at Chesterton House, Carl Johnson introduced me as a theologian. I reminded him privately that I am a biblical scholar. We deal with texts, their languages, histories, genres, and forms. We only dabble in theology and philosophy. A theologian, by contrast, also deals with texts and languages and genres. Add to that more languages and the history of ideas and the history of the church. Theologians are adept in philosophy, culture, and anthropology. They know about sin and evil, goodness and beauty, and truth and their relations. Like a musical conductor, they bring all of this learning together in their work, sometimes in a single sentence. I will risk my controversial opinion that the theologian is still the premier intellect in the academy. Dr. Carl Johnson, tonight we're in the company of your theologian. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Junius Johnson.
I think we have one too many Dr. Johnsons in the house. I should just go. Well, thank you to Carl and the Chesterton House for giving me the chance to come and speak, and thank you to the Neusses for this wonderful opportunity to speak to you tonight. It's my first time at Cornell, and it completes my lifelong tour of the Ivies, so I'm happy to finally fill up what's lacking. Say the best for last, yes. Although I must say, Yale did beat Cornell last weekend, so I apologize for your sudden but inevitable defeat. Wonder and imagination are related capacities. Imagination is the faculty by which we play in possibility. We treat the non-real as the possibly real. We draw abstractions as closely as we may towards concretion. There is perhaps no work more analogous to divine creation than human imagination. Wonder is the response we have in the moment of the recognition of great disparity. Thus, we wonder when we learn something new, which is really a recognition either of the prior depths of our ignorance or the newly revealed depths of the world. We wonder before that which is unexpected, because of the disparity between our expectations and what has happened. Before that which is a breakthrough, because of how unimaginable it seemed such a short while ago. Before that which required great strength or intellect or industry in order to exist, and at unhoped-for joys and sorrows. What these two capacities have in common is that they are concerned with the expansion of the square footage of our interiority. Interiority here is something like the space our soul has to move around in. One way to come at it is to think of it as mental capaciousness. A broad interiority opens great vistas for thought, while a narrow one constrains and stifles thought. I will use the word soul throughout this talk, and it is important. For were I to say instead mind or intellect, this would be incomplete and misleading. The intellect is but one of the personal powers. At the very least, persons are also endowed with will, which I don't think can be reduced to intellect or vice versa. I use the word soul to cover the combination of intellect and will that either is or stands in for the entire rational interiority of the human person. One needn't believe in a literal soul, like I do, for this usage to make sense. Now, both of these capacities, intellect and imagination and wonder, confront us with the reality that the world is larger and stranger than we know or experience daily. This knowledge automatically expands our interior space. When we know the world to be larger, we clear more space in our soul for it to penetrate us. We learn to think and dream bigger, which in turn unlocks more imagination and wonder. The neglect of these faculties leads to their atrophy, which is a shrinking of the space available for the soul to move around in. This is because of a persistent and pernicious tendency for the human mind to believe that all it has seen or thought to be possible is all that is possible. There's a sort of paradoxical irrationality by which the more we see of the world, the more confident we become that we know how the world must be. I call this paradoxical because as we see more of the world, we are continually moved to surprise. We had no idea such beauty or majesty existed, or existed in this place, or existed in this way. I find it paradoxical that our response to this is not to become convinced that the world will continue to surprise us, but to think that now that we have checked one more unknown off the list, the world's ability to surprise us is lessened. And so the less we see of wonders, the more we become convinced that the world is simply not a wonderful place, and the sense of wonder comes to be seen as a luxury or an irrelevance. By such means, daily life, with its tyrannical pettiness of mundane necessities, pushes wonder and imagination to the side, and in so doing shrinks our worlds. Except this is a false dichotomy. And like all false dichotomies, it distorts rather than describes reality and hinders rather than fosters understanding. The dichotomy is false because to call the frivolities and inescapable but monotonous duties of daily life mundane, that is, worldly, is to slander the magnificent world in which we find ourselves placed, to render it a thing of little account. This is not an attack on wonder, but rather the confession that we have already abandoned our allegiance to wonder. For one must have already surrendered the type of attentiveness productive of wonder in order to think the world to be such a place. Well, my project here today is essentially an exercise in re-enchantment. You can think of it as an apology for the world, by which I mean not just the little corner of it that we call home, but the vast interconnected cosmos to which our entire imaginary must become attuned. My argument will unfold in two parts. First, I will consider the grounds of wonder: attentiveness, openness, and clarity of vision, the latter of which requires honesty and humility. Second, I will cast a vision for a wonderful life. This vision will itself unfold in two parts. In the first, I will describe the dynamics of wonder consisting of intimation, encounter, and rapture. In the second, I will speak to the necessity of wonder. Tilling the earth, an exploration of the ground of wonder. Wonder is an experience that arises spontaneously in the soul in response to some stimulus that is external, at the very least external to the identity of the one wondering. Insofar as I wonder, that which causes me to wonder must be conceptually distinct than my act of wonder. As such, wonder cannot be coerced or seized. We cannot force ourselves to wonder. But if this is so, then it might seem that one could not, in fact, do any work towards increasing one's experience of wonder. All we can do is wait for such moments to find us. But this is false. For while we cannot coerce or produce moments of wonder, we may nevertheless train our sense of wonder. A well-trained sense of wonder is a disposition that makes us prompt for the experience of wonder, and so makes such experiences more likely when the proper stimuli are offered. And as I will discuss in the last part of the talk, the proper stimuli are much more common than we tend to believe. My purpose for the moment, then, is to consider some of the dispositions that predispose us well for wonder. First, attentiveness. Attentiveness is a sort of active receptivity that has to do with our overcoming a customary way of thinking that we have, which is to think in terms of a duality between action and passion, between activity and passivity. You see, authentic human existence is active-passive. We are placed in a world that will condition and affect us, but we're also given agency within that world. And this can be no mere alternation. One moment we're acting, one moment we're being passive, another moment we're being active, then we're being passive. Rather, we act most characteristically when we act in ways that combine being acted upon and the type of agency for which we are most especially suited. And I submit that this active-passive agency is attentiveness, an intellectual activity that is actively receptive. This activity is bodily, for it makes use of the senses, and it is intellective, using our soul. And yet what we use body and intellect for is to make space within ourselves. The activity of attentiveness aims at the cognition and parsing of the details of the world around us. This involves holding back judgment and letting be. The passivity of attentiveness aims at the space within which these others may unfold themselves to us. One cannot create a passion in oneself by acting. Rather, action clears space for passion. We see this in the case of one who decides after a long hiatus to reopen to the possibility of love. That great affection that we call falling in love cannot be compelled, but the heart can be disposed towards it such that one is much more likely to feel it. This is the task of shaping and molding the space into which the other, once encountered, will come. There is no doubt that the other is encountered to a significant extent according to the categories of the one experiencing, the one perceiving. On the one hand, we perceivers will modulate the things we encounter, will modulate their characteristics to match our expectations and values. We tend to see things like we want to see. On the other hand, we also shrink things to fit into our available space. If the thing we're looking at is too disproportionate to this space, we will not be able to see it at all, or we will see it as something other than what it really is. Attentiveness, then, is primarily other-directed. It lingers over the contours of the other with a firm determination to get those contours right and to introduce them faithfully into the space of reflection. Even when it turns to the self, it does so only for the sake of the other, to prepare the self to be such as can receive the other without reducing, distorting, or commodifying the other. Attentiveness considers the other worthy of serious encounter a priori, without need for argument or proof. Of course, it is not all up to us. Things grab our attention, often apart from or even against our will. But we always have a choice whether we will give our attention to those things that call for them, and so honor those things or persons, or whether we will wrench our attention away and thus, by dismissing, pass judgment on the worth of the other. Openness. The effect of increased attentiveness is to increase one's openness. Openness is a disposition whereby one is prompt to encounter new things. It is true that even apart from the developmental work of attentiveness, one has a certain degree of openness, and it may be developed in other ways. But attentiveness tackles openness head-on, aiming to increase this trait within us. Where attentiveness is an activity-passivity of the mind, openness is a disposition of the will. An open will is not predetermined to acceptance, but it is slow to move in judgment. This renders it slow to lock into a determinate shape, which in turn renders it more malleable. Openness is the elasticity of the will. This, I think, is critical, because the will not yet calcified can call the intellect back from its excesses and create opportunities for attentiveness. But openness is also a kind of seizability. It places the self at the disposal of outside forces to be caught up into their uses. Thus, it is a vulnerability of sorts. And as with all vulnerabilities, there is risk. The risks, indeed, are very great, for sometimes one is caught up into something so much bigger than oneself that one is changed forever. One is not safe. As Bilbo says, "It's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept to." Openness doesn't keep its feet. It gives them free rein. Of course, all the old fairy stories agree. Without risk, one is unlikely ever to encounter wonder, or to be able to recognize it if one does. Clarity of vision. Wonder is a kind of true connection to reality. More on that shortly. Thus, deception and distortion hinder the soul from breaking through to wonder. For this reason, in order that the soul be well disposed to wonder, it must be characterized by clarity of vision. This requires both honesty and humility. Honesty is the virtue that guards against the vice of deception. But in order that vision be clear, the type of honesty that is required is self-honesty. For self-deception infects our vision by distorting the very power by means of which we see. When the very seeing power is diseased, nothing that it sees is seen according to its proper mode of being. Even if an object of vision of sufficient power to show its magnificence, even in a diseased perceptual space, should come into view, it will not be able to fully unfold itself there. The sources of dishonesty in the soul are typically self-interest and prejudice. Self-interest attempts to warp everything into advantage for the self. This occurs both by converting everything into its use value, what can I do with it, and by denying to something its proper form because that form is perceived to be a threat to the safety, security, or desires of the soul. Prejudice is a premature judgment that may be motivated by any number of factors. The most important one to mention now, since we've already covered the ways in which the soul intentionally aims at distortion for its own ends, is ignorance. There is a sort of ignorance that comes through no fault of one's own, and this has nothing to do with honesty. You're not being dishonest if you're ignorant and it's not your fault. But there is also culpable ignorance, as when one has in general neglected to inform oneself concerning important matters out of intellectual sloth, or when one has avoided specific knowledge in order not to have to face the implications and ramifications. These types of ignorance are absolutely dishonesties, and they pollute the perceptual space. Humility. The theme of humility as a disposition for wonder has been implicit in several things I've said already, but it ought to be made more explicit because it runs so contrary to our nature. Wonder is fundamentally not about the self. It is the response of the self to something else, and the self only comes into the picture as the site, the location of the response, and perhaps as a comparison to the wonderful thing. We note our relative smallness in relation to the wonder. And so wonder requires that the self not grow beyond its proper measure and thus eclipse the wonderful thing before us. We must decrease that it may increase. Too high a conception of oneself distorts our ability to see the discrepancy in size between us and the object that inspires wonder. The wondrous seems less wondrous when we are full of an inflated sense of our own wondrousness. And yet wonder also requires that we not have too low an opinion of ourselves. In part, this is because when the size discrepancy gets to be too big, we run the risk of not being able to see the wondrous at all. But it is also because to receive wonder, we must believe that we are worthy of it at some level. Many have turned away from the first stirrings of wonder because of a sense that even if such things did exist, they wouldn't show themselves to one so lowly. This not thinking too lowly of ourselves is also humility. For true humility aims not to think as lowly of oneself as possible, but to see oneself truly, to not think of oneself other than as one ought. Second part of the talk, encounter and rapture, the dynamics of wonder. So I'm going to turn now to a description of the movement into wonder, and I'm going to divide this into three stages: intimation, encounter, and rapture. I will speak largely of great wonders, for as Socrates argues in the Republic, it is often easier to describe a thing in its larger forms than in its smaller ones. I will return to more quotidian wonders at the end of the talk. An image to which I will return throughout this section is the image of a black hole in space. These regions of space could be differentiated into three parts: the gravity well, which is the entire area affected by the gravitational pull of the black hole; the event horizon, or the point of no return, at which escape velocity has become so high that nothing can escape; and the singularity, the heart of the black hole, where matter is so densely packed that the laws of physics break down. First, intimation, the first stirrings of wonder in the soul. Wonder often begins with quite a different feeling, a small presentiment, like a gaze caught for the first time from across the room, a gaze that heralds not greatness, but the possibility of greatness. One's heart leaps, not because the presentiment in itself is so great, but because what it promises is so great. This is to catch sight of the wondrous thing from far off. What I see in her eyes in that moment is the great marvel of a relationship that may be approaching. And in moments suspended out of time, I see indistinctly a succession of joys stretching down the years into the fullness of a life lived together. I know that it is as yet only possible. Indeed, the obstacles to its realization, especially in its fullest form, are so many and so daunting that the likelihood of it coming to actualization is very low. But nevertheless, I am arrested and captivated, for I can't deny the beauty of the glimpse. Every physical object, we're told, has gravity, and thus a gravity well, however slight. This gravity well is the way in which its environment is pulled in towards it. When other physical objects encounter this, there is a real effect, however subtle. Analogously, every wondrous thing, and everything is wondrous, is surrounded by an aura that can first touch the sensitive soul, that is, a soul well prepared in the ways we have been discussing, and thus prime the pump for the coming encounter. This aura is the way in which things condition their environments. We have seen this expressed in the physical sciences with a variety of discoveries that complicate traditional accounts of the boundaries of things. But this is just one way of representing that things are not self-contained, but in fact stamp something of themselves on the world around them, and receive something also from that world. As we move towards each thing, we first come into the realm of its influence, and only subsequently encounter the thing itself. This I would liken to the outer edges of the gravity well of a black hole. Once one has passed into the gravity well, one is experiencing the effects of the black hole itself. But depending on the sensitivity of one's sensors, one could travel a long way into this well before becoming aware that one is in it. One could even conceivably journey through a whole region of space that is in the black hole's gravity well without ever becoming aware of it. This phenomenon of intimation is a very significant and powerful one that it won't do to rush too quickly past. It is perhaps true that nothing in this world arrives unheralded, without preparation, even though we often miss the first signs of its coming. But in retrospect, the path is often so clear that we marvel that we didn't see it coming. The soul well prepared for wonder is more likely to catch the first distant hints of its music, to stop and strain, and so to be in the right place for its arrival. Encounter. In encounter, we establish a true connection to reality. While our understanding of that reality is still filtered through our concepts, prejudices, and openness, nevertheless, we have, in fact, made contact. Now, I'm intentionally avoiding the language of penetration here, as when, for example, one says we penetrate to the heart of the matter. Indeed, consistent with what I've said earlier about making space within ourselves for the wonder to take hold, we might rather be said to be penetrated than to penetrate. But this too is false, because there's no question of penetration in encounter. Encounter halts rather at vis-a-vis, the face-to-face gaze. This first moment of contact is the mutual presence of one being to another. To receive the intimation of a wonder is to come under its influence without yet coming face-to-face with it. Encounter is what happens when that influence is followed back to its source, whether intentionally or unintentionally. This face-to-face encounter is no further out than minimum safe distance. We are not yet in jeopardy, but we are on the verge of being in great jeopardy. We have come to the event horizon. The event horizon, so named because beyond it no event can influence an outside observer in any way, forms the boundary of safety. If one is to know more, one must cross this boundary, with no guarantee that return is possible. Indeed, with the expectation that return is not possible. From the event horizon, it is possible to see the wonder and to study it, but one's experience of it remains external. There remains a deeper experience, namely the plunge into its depths. Which brings us to rapture. The last stage of wonder is rapture, whereby we are caught up into the wonder. This necessarily involves letting go, surrendering to the other. Here, an inversion occurs. We have, in preparing ourselves for wonder, been making a space within ourselves. But now we find that the wonder doesn't enter into us, but rather we are caught up into it. This is not at all surprising, for insofar as this encountered being is in fact a wonder, it exceeds our being. We wonder precisely at the dimension of it that exceeds us in some way. And so it cannot enter into us. We may only enter into it. All of our making space was really just clearing the ground for contact. At the last, we do not capture and so tame wonder, but rather we are carried beyond ourselves and beyond all we thought possible. What we enter into in this rapture is singularity. Here there is no longer a question of encountering its influence. One has entered into the thing itself. I like the term singularity for this because several of its senses apply. In its most fundamental sense, singularity indicates uniqueness. And this uniqueness is not just part of a thing's wonder. It is the heart of it. This wonder is irreplaceable, non-exchangeable, and unrepeatable. Not only is it unrepeatable, it can't even be encountered in the same way more than once. In every experience of wonder, part of what moves us is the singularity of the thing encountered, the knowledge that we have come to this place uniquely, and that this place can never be come to again except in memory, which changes things. Mathematically, the singularity is the point at which a function takes on an infinite value or becomes non-differentiable. So in a wonder, there is a collapse or exploding when one is raptured to it, for one comes into contact with an inexhaustibility of the sort the human heart and soul long for. Every wonder is mysterious. It invites us into a depth that is never ending because endlessly generative. Its fruitfulness grounds a virtual infinitude. The boundary of what it offers, ever beckoning, is also ever receding. And yet real progress is made and one is led through a fantastical landscape. This is, I think, a very important concept. We tend to get caught up on infinity as the size of a thing. And so we measure the outer boundaries of a thing, and if we can find those boundaries, then it's finite, and if we cannot, then it's infinite. And that sort of quantitative infinity is an important one, but there was a distinction that was made in the Middle Ages between quantitative and qualitative infinity, where qualitative infinity didn't have to do with whether or not a thing had boundaries and whether those boundaries could be found. It had to do with something else, with a sort of intensivity of being. And I think this is a type of infinity that is much more common and that we encounter regularly in the world. What makes it infinite, the lack of boundary at question, is not the fact that it is unmeasurably big, but rather the fact that there's no end to what it's able to produce. Its fruitfulness is never ending. And this is what I'm calling inexhaustibility. If something is inexhaustible, it is able to continue to offer new experiences and new encounters indefinitely. And that is a type of infinity. Astronomically, the singularity is a point of immense density. As a result of this density, the laws of physics begin to break down. Likewise, in wonder, accustomed rules begin to fail. This is nowhere clearer than in the wonder that is love, where all boundaries are crossed or disregarded in the flight to the beloved. Wonder is the type of singularity that reorders the priorities of reality, and in so doing causes us to question whether those priorities were right in the first place. Now, the surprise of every wonder is that there is a path home. We do find our way back to ourselves. The journey to fairyland ends where it began, in some unassuming part of our own world. Bilbo's journey is exemplary. We don't just go there, we also come back again. But the path is not generally predictable. We were right to fear that we would find no return once we passed the event horizon, for no path was visible at that point. We can't get home that way. It is a one-way portal. The only way back is forward, and the only way out is through. I want to stress that every stage of wonder leaves its mark on the one who enters it. To have had even just the first stirrings of wonder changes one, and to have come face-to-face encounter with wonder changes one very deeply. But crossing the event horizon, entering into the singularity, comes with the greatest risk, because one's very self is at play. The forces of wonder will stretch and compress you, and it is not at all certain that you will survive the process. Actually, what is certain is that you, as you know you, will not survive. The you who comes out, if you come out, will be changed forever in ways you cannot predict. Why bother with rapture then? What is the reward of this great gamble? Why, the risk is the reward. The point of wonders is to change us. We desire them for this very purpose. Even if we don't want to walk in fairyland or face a dragon, we desperately long to know that they are there. Because if they're there, that means the world is of a certain sort. Now, what business is it of ours of what sort the world is, except because we are co-worldly with it? If we belong to the world and it is as dry and disenchanted as we have learned to think that it is, then how mean and petty does that make us? But if we and the world we belong to are full of enchantment and wonder, then we too may be much more than our common imagining. With such knowledge, we may exclaim with Hamlet, "What a piece of work is a man." But it's not only for this general increase in our self-understanding that encounter with wonder is desirable. It is also desirable because it changes us individually. Wonderful experiences are life-defining, and we walk away from them different than we were before, deeper, richer, at the same time both more grave and more jolly. The experience of wonder adds weight to our souls and contributes to our ability to leave lasting footprints on the world. Our final section, Quotidian Wonder. This has all wandered a bit from where I started and from what I promised in the promotional materials, which was to speak of the value of wonder in daily life. Daily life is just a distant speck on the horizon at this point. But it was necessary first to get a clear sense of what the grounds for wonder are and for what the dynamic of the experiences of wonder are in order to be able to say anything specific about the role that wonder plays in our lives. So to begin the turn to address this issue of the quotidian necessity of wonder, let me return to a claim I made earlier, that everything is wondrous. How can I say that everything is wondrous when the wondrous is what exceeds us? Do I make of humans the smallest things in creation? Not at all. A wonder need only exceed us in some way, not in all ways. And everything exceeds us in at least this one important way. It is a microcosm, a tiny universe that holds within itself an inexhaustibility that is its particularity, both as this type of thing and as this thing. It is true that trees, insofar as trees are a particular way of imaging God in creation, and there's an inexhaustibility to that particular image that trees are that we can never get to the end of. But it's also the case that oak trees do so in a way different than maple trees, and that is equally inexhaustible. And it's also the case that this oak tree does so differently than every other oak tree that is or ever has been or ever will be. And so there's a layering of mystery, a layering of inexhaustible encounter within each thing as we progress from the general sort of thing it is to the specific sort of thing it is to the very thing that's directly in front of us. So for this reason, each thing, even though finite, and in many cases smaller than us, kittens, nevertheless, each thing has a dimension that we cannot get to the end of, and this inexhaustibility is sufficient to ground wonder. Indeed, part of the joy of the path I hope to lead you onto is that it is one from which it becomes clear that the world is so brimming with wonder that there is no thing encountered in it that cannot rapture us to the type of depth that we long for. The smallest things become immensely satisfying when once we realize that no thing is only small. As a wonder, it is also possessed of a greatness that renders it precious. And so wonder is available with a prodigality that renders it sufficiently abundant for daily use. See, things that are rare can't be used every day because they'll get exhausted. We'll use them up. And so the more rare something is, the more we set it aside. We build glass cases for them. We put them in museums and put lights all around them and put ropes so you can't get too close. And you can gather around with other tourists and take pictures and show people the picture and say you were there. But when something is sufficiently common, there's no need to do that because we don't have to worry that we're going to run out of it, that it's going to be wiped out. Every wonderful thing as a wonderful thing is so uniquely precious that it's unrepeatable and deserves to be guarded. And yet every wonderful thing is a source of such inexhaustible newness in the world that it's capable of filling up our daily lives. And the world is so brimful of wonderful things that we don't have to worry that by using this wonder, we're going to run out of them. As long as there are things, we'll be okay. As an aside, it should already be clear that the implications for ethics, societal, professional, environmental, personal, are enormous. Well, I think it should be clear that the type of experience I'm talking about is not the province only of the one who would write fantastical stories. This is something we can agree on, right? If you're going to write fantastical stories, whether they be destined for books or for movies or for television, you have to do with wonder. You need to be thinking about wonder, and you need to be sort of an expert in wonder so that you can create these, you can write that into these experiences that you craft. But if what I've said is true, we can't confine wonder only to the experts and say, well, those guys have got it because they think about wonder, we don't have to. Wonder is indeed precisely as practical and urgent as the need to have such stories is in the first place. The only reason we need these stories that are bigger than life is because we need lives that are bigger than life. What the fantastical stories do is feed the part of our souls that long for more. They do this precisely by ushering us into the experience of wonder. A great book, a great movie, a great symphony, a great work of visual art, a great play, a great dance. All of these things are wonderful spaces in the sense that the artists have saturated the spaces with wonder such that however unaccustomed your soul may be to experience wonder, you've got a chance of catching some of it. So as I said at the outset, these experiences are no mere luxuries. Without them, our sense of possibility shrinks, and we confine the world to being no more than the drab, utilitarian monotony we so often experience through the long years of our lives. This uninspired wasteland trains our souls in inattentiveness. For all that is there to be seen is the realization of the futility and banality of our surroundings. In such circumstances, it is better not to be attentive, not to notice too much, lest one be overcome with despair. If we keep our heads down, we can plod on, trudging through nowhere to get nowhere. The years go by swiftly after all, but we fill them with distraction and willful ignorance. Because as much as we generally don't want to die, we can hardly bear to admit that we don't call this living. It has to be remembered that this understanding of reality is a construct. It's a construct born not out of any conclusive proof or argumentation, but at best out of a despair that looks back on a life insufficiently attended by wonder and projects that outward to the world at large. This is precisely what must not be done, because the soul is not the measure of the cosmos. What you have seen or experienced, what you can imagine, is not the definer of the boundaries of reality. Consider this. The soul of a child finds wonders and delights everywhere, even in the smallest things. Where does this sense go? We educate it away. We train it out because we've come to believe that it isn't practical. And so the soul grows old and inflexible well before its time. Insufficiently prepared for wonder due to lack of intentional preparation, it finds decreasing amounts of wonder in the world. It has learned to love wonder in childhood, but the adult looks back upon a desert bereft of wonder and attributes the childhood experience to immaturity and insufficient brain development. And so, missing the experience, but refusing to consider it normative, the soul atrophies, confined to smaller and smaller space. And then we deduce that since we have seen so little wonder, the world is not really a wonderful place. This is an absurd conclusion. I've never seen a miracle, therefore miracles don't happen. This is absurd. Have you seen all the things that can happen? Of course not. Why do we not rather conclude that our task is to recapture the enchantment of the childhood experience? We speak so freely and easily and often theologically problematically, about the innocence of children. And we envy them their innocence, and yet we make no effort to recapture it. We make no effort to reproach ourselves with our lack of innocence, because perhaps the opposite of innocence isn't experience, but guilt. Why do we not see that the task of growth is not the abandoning of the childlike, but its fulfillment? Our great dreamers and visionaries have done exactly this, and we celebrate them for it. The great Disney empire, whose size is immeasurable because constantly changing as they gobble up everything around them that's any good at all, is built upon the belief that inside of every adult is a child who's in love with wonder waiting to be awakened again. What Walt Disney tried to sell at his theme parks, and sell it for a steep price he did, was the experience of childlike wonder. It wasn't there to give children wonder. It was there so parents would take their children there and rediscover in themselves the same thing that they delight to see in their children's eyes. I love to see my daughter's eyes and my son's eyes light up with joy, but I spend very little time looking or expecting the same from my own eyes. So we must return to the paths of wonder. We must return to the paths of wonder. We must cultivate in ourselves the sensitivity that will enable us to tremble along with those first intimations. We must learn the rigorous tenacity required to follow those intimations back to face-and-face encounter with the mysterious and the strange. We must develop the courage to leap beyond the event horizon into the infinite depths of the wonderful and emerge changed. We must do this because the problems of our lives, our professions, and our world are too complex and significant to be met by small-souled, petty-minded individuals. Our families, our corporations, governments, and classrooms, and our environment are awesome and wondrous realities. And to meet the challenges they face, we must come with souls enlarged by familiarity and by regular congress with the magnificent. We can neither afford to be so small-minded as to think that the way things have been done before is the way that they need to be done, nor so haughty as to think that new means improved, and that the past is best left in the past. Rather, we need to reinvigorate the past with the kind of lively, wondrous encounter that unlocks its inexhaustible fruitfulness. We need to turn towards the future with hearts and minds characterized by open spaces into which the unexpected and unfamiliar may come, and from which we may be raptured into the paths we have not yet thought to imagine. As long as we confine the obligation of wonder to the storytellers, we will bar ourselves from living the types of stories in which alone we could find life. I end then with this plea: restore to the world what is its rightful character, and let loose your souls to be the marvels they were meant to be. Your imaginarium, your reason, your will, and your heart, once transformed into ground zero of an encounter from which you can be launched into realms as yet uncognized by the human spirit, are the condition of the possibility of a meaningful life. But I must repeat this warning to you. The place to which I would send you is not safe. You cannot go there if you are determined that it will not change you. Your idolatry of self-worship will stay your feet. If you go, you will encounter more than you have space for in your philosophy. You will learn why religion will never die out from the human race. You will come to see that matter is not all that matters. An enlarged view comes with a price. For just beyond our field of vision lies that which conditions all we have ever known. In George MacDonald's novel, Phantastes, the hero, swept into fairyland from his bedroom, only returns by means of his death in that strange other place. It was not perhaps the only way home, But as he continues to make specific choices and to transgress the rules of this fantastical land, his path becomes increasingly narrow and increasingly difficult. It becomes a certain and inevitable path for him on the basis of his transgressions. And so for those who have transgressed, it is ever true that the only path to a life worth living lies through the land of death. And so I leave you with this verity, pulled from the depths of wonder and offered as the true sign of the journey. If you wish to leave behind half-life and truly live, you have to be willing to lose your all and die. There is no other way to attain resurrection. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for joining us this evening in such an engaging, thoughtful talk. I'm going to open us up now to a time of questions, and I'll filter those for you. So have your questions in mind, and I'll give you just a minute to think about them, and I'll just start with one question. I had the advantage of reading ahead in your forthcoming book and material you shared, and I know where you've gone there. And so as you're talking about wonder tonight, I thought about the fact that there's wonder that originates in beauty, but there's wonder that originates or arises from ugliness, from death, or from suffering, or from violence, or corruption. Is there an ethical shape to wonder?
Yes, yeah, that's a good question, and there absolutely is. It won't do to think that the only great things in the world are great goods. There are great evils in the world, and there are terrors in the world. The night is full of darkness and dark things that want to swallow your soul. But here's the thing. The Christian tradition has long maintained that evil has no independent existence. It's not the case, it's not the Christian picture that reality is built upon an eternal and unresolvable struggle between equally powerful forces of light and forces of goodness. In fact, there's one first thing that exists, and that's the omnipotent Trinitarian God. And from him, by his will and through his power, other things exist. Evil then comes about as a taking of the goods that God has created and a twisting them to ends that are contrary to their own nature and contrary to the divine nature. This is possible because creatures are given a certain amount, some creatures are given a certain amount of will, by means of which they are offered the chance to willingly participate in the divine work or to work against it. Why does this matter? Well, it matters for this reason. It means that even the great terrors, their greatness has its root in the divine greatness, in the divine goodness. Part of what's terrible about a great terror is precisely its greatness, which is only possible because it was such a great thing before it was twisted and cancerously turned into something else. This is one of the reasons why moral questions and by our responses to moral atrocities are so complicated and convoluted. I love watching movies where things blow up and are destroyed, and natural disasters wrecking all of the monuments of man and effacing every memory of our society from the face of the earth. I love it. I don't know how many times I've seen the Eiffel Tower destroyed, but it's fun every time. And it's not because I hate the French, it's quite the opposite. Why is that? Well, there's a certain, dare I say, beauty to it. How can that be? Well, precisely because there's a reminder that these things aren't ultimate. That they don't have an ultimate right to exist, that they're in their very nature transient. Okay, let's get darker then. What about sin? What about genocide? What about racism and slavery? What about rape? What about pedophilic rape? Where's the beauty? Here, we're characterized by a wonder that such things should exist at all. The disparity we see is between the recognized goodness of creation and the possibility of such great evils existing. And so we call it the problem of evil. It just doesn't seem possible that such things could be. And if they are, how could there be an omnipotent, all-good God who's behind things? Why doesn't he do something? Why isn't he about the task of addressing this situation? Maybe he doesn't have the power to do so, in which case he isn't omnipotent, or maybe he doesn't care, in which case he's not all good. And either one of those would be a problem. Well, friends, it should be no surprise that we can't see the beauty of these things because these things are not yet beautiful. All things will be adjusted in their time. This is why the Christian tradition has long had an important and an indispensable doctrine known as the Last Judgment. That all things in the universe are not the way they're supposed to be, but that God is actually not only doing something, but he's got another big thing he's going to do to deal with this. Julian of Norwich, who was a 14th century British mystic, had a set of visions concerning the passion of Christ and the love of God. And in this vision, she sees that there is a great deed that God will do, as a result of which, she says, all manner of things shall be well. I think readers of Julian through the years have gotten themselves turned about and in trouble because they try to identify what the nature of the great deed is. Oh, it's universal salvation, or oh, it's this, or oh, it's that. But in the text, Julian says you can't know what the deed will be ahead of time. So any idea you have as to what the deed might be is necessarily wrong because it's unknowable until God does it. What she's trying to say is that faith knows that the whole has been made beautiful in its time, even though faith can't see how anything could respond to the severity and the depth of the evils that we see around us in the world today. This has become a very unpopular position. It's very unpopular today to think that things like genocide and rape can in any way be made up for by God. They're just, if you do that, you're dishonoring the victims of these horrible, depersonalizing evils. But friends, I would say that if you deny that God is able to make things well, then you're arguing that injustice is more powerful than justice, that evil is more powerful than good. I was in Rwanda a few summers ago speaking with a group of Anglican pastors, priests, and catechists doing some theological education. And one of them asked me, can God bring good out of genocide? And I thought, oh boy, here we go. Why did I come to Rwanda? And I said to them, listen, guys, you guys have lived through something, because these guys all lived through it. And their world is still shattered by it. I said, you guys have lived through something more horrible than I know how to conceive and that I want to even try to conceive. My mind recoils from trying to imagine the great suffering that you guys have gone through, even though I do make myself go through the Genocide Museum every time that I go there and spend significant time there looking at the pictures and reading the stories. And so I, as an outsider, would hate to come in and I don't feel that I can be in a position to talk to you about genocide when I've never experienced one and you have. But here's what I do know. If we're not willing to say that God is bigger than genocide, then we've got an awfully small God. We've got a real problem there. So I think that I can recommend Wonder so enthusiastically and with so few disclaimers precisely because I think when you come to the situation where anything grabs your soul with a sense of wonder, whether that be awe or terror, you're at a place where the veil surrounding the true nature of reality is thin, and you've got the possibility of coming through to some real and important knowledge. Medieval thought is very focused on the idea that there's two main ways to learn something. You can learn it by a positive example or by a negative example. And no one is necessarily better than the other. So I'm confident sending you to Wonders because those things are really significant and really important. And I'm not afraid of what you're going to find there because I know that behind every wonder lies a will and a power that is shaping all things towards good in ways that we can't yet wrap our heads around. The problem of evil bothers you and you can't imagine how God could do anything that would make up for it. Just remember that the idea is that an omniscient God can imagine quite a lot more than you can. Right? I really think it's a very bad practice to think, well, I can't imagine it, therefore God can't do it. Well, I hope that you think God is more clever than you are.
Thank you. Another question from the floor.
Yeah.
We need to repeat any of that for broadcasting, for recording? I mean, summarize it? Yes. So the question, if I take it, is does multimedia, does our ability to make things more and more realistic detract something from wonder?
Yeah.
Is that
I think part of the concern is there's a intellectual sloth is always the great enemy of wonder, right? It's just easier not to wonder at things, not to experience wonder, because when you experience wonder, something comes in that breaks your whole picture, your whole frame of reference, and then you've got to go back and you've got to rework things, and you've got to make space for new things you didn't know about before, and it's just exhausting. It's an awful lot of work, right? So it's easier to just not have those kinds of experiences and file everything into categories that you already have. This is actually one of the things that I find to be most troubling about the way that the science works these days, is that there's a gravity towards the old model that I think makes us slow to recognize when the model isn't working anymore. And so the paradigm shifts that are required to move us out of ways of thinking that were functional at a certain level of knowledge, but really a relatively poor approximation of the nature of reality, when we're on the cusp of a new model that is going to be a better approximation of the nature of reality by an incremental increase, and will allow new levels of functionality, often we can be slow to make that shift because the weight is so heavily weighted towards the old paradigm, the old model. In this case, right, it's whenever the kid's imagination or our imagination has to do less work, then we get used to not exercising our imaginations. Why should I bother trying to think up a cool story when I've got a near infinity of story options available through Netflix and Hulu and every network and unknown to man, right? Why do I need to imagine great stories and journeys when I can just go and see the latest Marvel movie? And so I think what's missing is, or rather the corrective would be to not let kids and ourselves off the hook for doing the work of imagining things. It's delightful to be able to go and see things with such vividness that you don't have to, it's all laid out for you, right? But imagination is a muscle, or at least it's analogous to a muscle, and it has to be worked out. And imagination is not sufficiently exercised by just taking in images. The role of imagination is actually to store images in order to then recombine them in new and unexpected ways. And so I think we have to be, what the campfire stories do is they force the children to bring images forth in their head. What reading books aloud does is it forces you to bring books out, these images out from your head. I have friends who say they can't read Harry Potter without seeing the actors from the movie. Everything in the Harry Potter looks like the movie to them, even if they read the book first. I don't know if I'm just weird, but that's not how it is for me. The movie pictures go right out of my head when I go back to the book, and the images that I had when I first read the book come back. They're more fundamental to me than the movie images are. And I think that's a task that we've got to be vigilant about keeping our kids engaged in. And I do think that books are a great answer, right? Both having books read to them as well as having them read books with you and out loud and on their own, it's great. Have them read something like the opening chapter of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then have them come describe to you visually what they're seeing. If they can draw it all, have them try to draw things out, right? Because that's the task of imagination, is recombining those images.
Yeah, here, and then I'll go there next.
You guys like Chesterton here. I didn't realize that. Yeah, I'm too serious a person by nature. I take myself too seriously by a lot, and I take everything around me too seriously. And so I've had to sort of train myself in humor, and that's only gone so far. But I do believe that not just humor, but humor is not exactly the right word, levity, right? And the Chesterton's insight, which plays wonderfully through all of his novels, is the realization, and I find it in Lewis also, that levity and gravity are not opposites, or not incompatible. But the same thing can be both weighty and light at the same time. And of course, the divine is above all this, right? So I think I've made some progress. I prefer a good Marvel movie punctuated by humor than I do a DC movie where it's just sad and brooding all the time. And to me, I think when I first learned to recognize greatness in literature, I thought that humor would be a distraction from the elevated loftiness of it. And now I come to think that no, the loftiness of it actually needs the humor so that it can trip along, so that it can progress, the story can progress with agile on its feet, as it were, right? I think of the elephants dancing in Fantasia. So I do think that humor is important, and I think that the lightness side of things is the harder thing for our society to get. we at this stage in the development of Western culture are much more prone to be too serious than to be light. And I think that the current state of civil discourse is exactly this sort of thing, right? You can't make jokes publicly anymore because as soon as you do, someone's going to take it very seriously, and then it's going to be a whole big thing, right? So I think that we do have a special need to focus on trying to understand how reality is made up of an interplay of both light and weighty.
Hello. Yeah. There we go.
Hello.
Hi. How do I, having never experienced like the true horrors of evil that you were talking about when you were in Rwanda, like genocide or rape or any of that, how do I, having never experienced those true horrors, how do I sympathize or even preach the message of God's love or any love in general to those who actually have gone through those?
Yeah, humility, right? I think that this is one of the things that I tried to keep in mind when I was in Rwanda, to understand that I was talking to a people whose souls had a depth to them because of the horrors they had experienced that my soul lacked. And that meant that even if I had something to teach them, I had to teach them from a position of one who is humble relative to them. Because they have a knowledge that I don't have. I don't want, but I don't have, and it's important to them. And I don't know how to honor that correctly. I can't say the right things or be sure not to say the wrong things to honor their pain. And so all I can do is acknowledge that there is this big gap between us. There is this great disparity. And that humility ought to lead me to want to listen. And I spent a lot of time listening and going to these pastors' churches out in the outskirts in these rural communities and sitting and listening to their people talk before daring to say anything to them. We have to understand, we have to learn something about their soul. We have to let them speak to us, and then out of what they speak to us, we can perhaps in great humility dare to say a few things.
Here, and then Carl's after that, Carl Moss.
Hi, thanks for an interesting presentation. I was kind of surprised as I was listening not to hear more of the role of emotion in wonder. I mean, you could say a lot about biblical examples where the primary reaction to a wonderful revelation was terror, fear. You could think of other ones that have sadness, joy. And when you broke it down into what is the soul is intellect and will. Where is emotion not part of the soul? And how do you integrate that in your view of wonder?
Yeah. Emotion is part of the soul, and traditionally emotion would come under will, which is a bit counterintuitive for us. We tend to think of emotions as being something that we have no control over and they just happen, and all we're responsible for is what we do after the emotion happens. I've heard people even go so far as to say, well, emotions have no moral value. They can't be sinful or not, they just are. What's sinful is what you do with the emotion after you experience it. This would be a very strange position to a great deal of the Christian tradition. It's out of the overflow of the heart that the mouth not only speaks, but feels. And so the fact that I had that emotional response is a result of the way that I formed my soul through the things that I paid attention to and the things that I've desired, and I'm culpable for that. If my soul is poorly disposed in such a way that I've become very violent and prone to violence as an anger as an emotional response, that's my fault, and I'm culpable for that. The will, sometimes referred to as the affect, has to do with all the parts of the person that we typically associate with the heart. It's that which chooses to cling to something in love, to flee something in fear or hatred, and all the other emotions are sort of wrapped up in that. I think emotions are incredibly important. I think humans have emotions because it's one of the ways we're in the image of God, that we have emotions because God has emotions. So take the biblical language about God's emotions very seriously. But why did I talk about emotion more in this presentation? Well, wonder is not an emotion, I don't think. Although wonder is elicitive of many emotions. And that those emotions can run the whole gamut. And I don't think there's any one thing to be said about the relationship between wonder and emotion. I think it's a whole other talk to try to suss out what types of emotions are should we have in certain cases, and should we not have, and what does it mean when we have them, and how do they then feed back into the experience, because emotions often are involved in these sort of feedback loops where the emotion can increase the sense of wonder, and then that can sort of grow and expand out in that way. And so I didn't have time to get into all of that. I haven't thought all that through, but I will say that I absolutely concur that that's a really important piece of our experience of wonder, right? Our experiences always bleed over into emotions, and I think that we need to see those as more seamlessly part of who we are than we've been accustomed to after, say, 19th century psychoanalysis.
I want to build on your astrophysics analogy.
Uh-oh.
And so I want to ask you a little bit about wonder and time. And I think the one thing as we get older, you know when you're an infant or when you're 10 years old how a summer seems like an eternity, and when you get to be my age, 10 minutes sounds like one thing I've observed, and I always thought, well, we're so busy with career and family and running around, and once you slow down and retire, that you can sort of go back and things will slow down. Well, I've experienced myself, and I also asked older people, and they say, no, it doesn't happen. So it continues to go faster, even when they're idle. So my question to you is a couple-fold. One is it possible that really that condition of wonder, that childlike condition of wonder, which we find so hard to achieve as we grow older, actually causes our perception of time to slow down? The next question would be, if that's the case, is it possible that, and I often think about eternity, is eternity itself, Christian eternity, a perpetual state of wonder where time becomes eternity? And then my last question would be, how then, as a spiritual discipline, do old folks like myself slow down time as a spiritual discipline to try to prepare or make that space and have that attentiveness to create wonder, in old age?
Yeah, so those are three great questions. The answer to the first question is yes. Attentiveness does dilate time. And so, the poet Byron famously said that he had lived 100 years and 25. And what he meant by that was because he lived an intentional, attentive life, he had packed more experience into his 25 years than most humans do in 100 years. And that's always rung true to me. There's also a great deal of reflection on this by certain Russian formalist literary critics, the sense that when you give your attention to something, time slows down and sometimes almost stops. And I absolutely think that one of the reasons why time seems to take so much more time when we're younger is because we're seeing more. We're attentive to the details rather than the big sweep of things. So that's one. Then eternity and time. Listen, I think the thing that I want to be aware of is heaven occurrence, a constant state of wonder. Yes, to the extent that that's a possibility for the human creature, but we may need to accept that as finite creatures, we might not be capable of sustaining a constant state of wonder. And so perhaps there's something like Sabbath in heaven, wonder Sabbath, whereby we're excused from having to notice just how awesome everything is. Or perhaps our capacities will be enlarged to the place where we can exist in a constant state of wonder. But I do think that I think our sense of wonder will be maximized in heaven. Whatever we're capable of, that's what we will have. Does that have a relationship to the eternity of heaven? Is it perhaps the case that the reason heaven is eternal is because we're so advanced in wonder that we're able to slow time down and have it there? I don't think so. For this reason, I think the never-ending duration of heaven is an important thing. All of God's rational creatures are everlasting. Every angel, every demon, every human will last forever. You had a beginning, but you have no end. And so there's no need to fit it all into a small space of time because we do have an unending space of time in which to do things. So I think what we'll see there is that perfect balance of a never-ending duration of time, which is great because it removes the urgency, right? I mean, a lot of us are very aware of the time that we have left and the things we want to get done, and as we grow older, the disparity between those two becomes ever more of a concern, right? Most academics don't retire because they feel they can't teach anymore, they don't like teaching anymore, but because they're afraid they're not going to get to that one book they really want to do if they keep teaching and doing their other administrative duties. Heaven takes that away. You don't have to fit it all in quickly now because you've got lengthy time. You meet a person, you think, gosh, I feel like I could just talk to this person for 1,000 years. Go ahead, because you're not going to lose any time with anybody else for doing that, right? So I think we'll find that balance of having all of that space, but also having each moment of that be as deep and rich as we just get little hints of in this life in our best moments. Finally, then, the question of spiritual discipline and how do we do this. This is actually very much something that a lot of monks have practiced through the years, the discipline of slowing down, of being attentive, of recounting God's wonders in minute detail in order to expand their awareness of how great and prodigal God has been in the creation of the world and how great God's goodness is towards us. So disciplines of spiritual meditation, both on the scriptures and on the God himself and on the world. All of these things have been recommended to us by the great Christian spiritualists and monks through the years. And also other practices that slow us down. One of the really important parts of life in a monastery is work, just good old-fashioned manual labor. And they train to think of work as a spiritual discipline. So you're not just washing the laundry, washing the habits of all the monks in the monastery, you're doing it as a form of prayer. And when you get into a physical activity like that and you're able to convert that into time for reflection, there is a kind of expansion in your sense of time that happens that I think is exactly that kind of preparing for eternity that you're talking about.
One more, yeah.
Of the unknown of wonder, and like a childlike wonder. Part of it is because children have not experienced, they're naive, they don't understand. Could you comment about wonder in terms of the unknown, which also then makes me think about faith, because so much of what we don't know, we end up having to have faith in that.
Yeah, and this is related to the point that I made about every small thing being not only small. Wonder does primarily have to do with the unfamiliar. It's because we see something as unfamiliar that it strikes us with wonder. But the trick is everything could be unfamiliar if only we slow down enough and pay attention to it, right, and give enough time to it. My favorite example of this is people. A person is so productive of surprise. They're so fruitful that you can be with the same person for 60, 70 years and still be surprised by them. I always love to ask, when I meet couples who've been married for more than 50 years, I ask them, does your spouse still surprise you? And I've never had the answer not be yes. I think that's very interesting. My son is fascinated with his hand currently. He's 1 year old. And he's seen it before, and he's done stuff with it, and he's become aware of it before. But occasionally he'll be waving at somebody, and then he'll just kind of lose it, right? What's happening in that moment is that something that's so familiar to him, suddenly he sees it in a way that's very unfamiliar. He recognizes that he hasn't sufficiently explored the wondrous mystery that this thing that's attached to him is, and he gets kind of caught up into it. I think that's an experience as we develop our sense of wonder, we'll have more often. We'll start to be aware of, gosh, I've walked by this tree every day for the last 20 years. This is an amazing tree. I really need to stop and spend some time looking at this thing.
I'm going to cut us off there. Carl Johnson has some announcements to make, but please join me again in thanking Dr. Junius Johnson for his talk.
Thank you, Junius. Thank you, Ryan. We have a wonderful weekend packed full of all kinds of great activities we invite you to participate in. And I actually don't really have to announce them because we've got a great little program. If you haven't picked one up, I encourage you to do so on your way out, and it'll walk you through the events of the weekend. If you're planning to come to the Sayers Conference on Vocation tomorrow afternoon, it is right here, the opening session right here in this room. 12:30 to 5 is the way it's listed in the bulletin here. The opening session actually starts at 1:30. We have registration out in the hallway from 12:30 to 1:30, but we'll be kicking off promptly at 1:30. And then, of course, we've got a great evening keynote address over in Statler. If you have not registered online, it would be a good thing to do, both for us and also for you. For you, you'll get some additional information about things like parking, which is pretty much the main challenge of the weekend, and how to connect to the Wi-Fi. Not all of those details are in the printed brochure. So if you haven't registered, it's also a bit of a favor to us because we're trying to plan food for the barbecue on Saturday. And even though we probably can't revise the numbers at this point, at least we'll know ahead of time if we're going to run out of food. I think that's all I have by way of announcements. So thank you very much for coming out this evening, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow.